I want you to type in, I want you to type in, without hitting enter, what you're using analytics for. Are you using it in your personal life? Are you using it in a startup? Are you using it as part of your day job? Are you using it to try and lead a better life? Are you using it to help a nonprofit? But I want you to take a minute or so and actually write down properly, what are you using analytics for in your life? And don't hit enter just yet, because I want you to reflect on this and try and put together a couple of sentences that explain what it is that you want to learn analytics for, what you're using it for today. How are you currently using data in your life? And so if you've taken a minute to sort of type that in as a sentence, I want, on the count of 3, we're all going to hit enter. I'm going to write down my answer while you're writing yours. And so now I'm going to hit enter, and you can see my answer, and you should also go ahead and hit enter as well. And this will give me an idea to make sure that I focus this thing on what you're hoping for. Engagement on EI webinars, that's a good one, knowing about analytics. Social research, helping your customers make better business decisions. Rita, I know you're doing consulting in that regard, for measuring impacts and create KPI dashboards. Personal development, I actually have an activity I do every December, and I strongly urge you all to do this, where I make one slide per major thing I need to do in my life. And then I try to write down a very specific metric for what I want to do, what would be success. So for example, I run a big conference on digital government, and one of the things I wrote down was to grow the attendance and the revenues by 20% in 2022. And that's a very concrete metric that I can track. And it sort of sets my goal for that for the whole year. And then I use that to prioritize what I'm doing. Tracking postage costs, that's a good one. So I'm going to tell you a story about Lean Analytics, and I'm going to explain what that is. Before we get started with that, here's a bit of context on me. Going back to the dawn of time, in my case, that's 1997. I started a company called Networkshop, which turned into a managed service provider and then a web performance company called Cohorts. I also did some work blogging and consulting around a brand called BitCurrent. My current company is called Solve for Interesting. As Pierangelo said, I ran a startup accelerator called Year One Labs. Today I work with a company called Embrace on running big tech events. And I'm also working on a book called Just Evil Enough with Ireland's own Emily Jane Ross. Over that time, I've launched a bunch of different events. I'm not really sure how I got into doing conferences. It started with Networld Interop, and since that time, I have launched a few of my own, including Startup Fest, Forward 50, Scale Tech, and early next year, Entertainment Analytics, which we haven't really launched yet, but we will be soon. I also chaired Strata, which was the world's biggest conference on data-driven data science and data-driven business. And over that time, I've written 4 books and 2 fairly short books. And I'm working, as I said, on Just Evil Enough, which is a subversive marketing playbook. So I've been spending a lot of time counting things and applying that understanding to business. I want to start with a story. Way back in the golden age of radio, there were a lot of radio stations running ads, and the radio stations needed to know how much to charge for those ads. And the advertisers needed to know which radio stations and which programs to support with their sponsorship. To support this, a company called Arbitron emerged, and they asked groups of people in a particular demographic to fill out these little listening diaries. This is one from 2005, but this goes back for decades and decades. Every 15 minutes, each participant was asked to fill out a simple line saying what radio station they were listening to. And then at the end of the week, they would send these things back, and every quarter, Arbitron would tally the results, and they would use that data to show how many people were listening to which radio stations from which demographics. That would affect the pricing of the advertising, and it would allow the advertisers to choose where to place their ads. This worked great because everybody was lying. The radio stations would know that the most profitable time slots were 8:15 to 8:30 and 8:30 to 8:45 in the morning, because that's when people were driving to work or commuting. And so they would run contests at around 8:28 every morning to convince people to stick around during those high stakes times. There was a group of Hispanic men in Los Angeles that were one of the demographics who all said that they were listening to community radio because that channeled funding to their local community. Of course, they were really listening to pop music, but they didn't tell anyone that. And many of these radio stations would run loud ads on Thursdays and Fridays. You know, you're listening to KROC FM, because nobody was actually filling these diaries out as they listened to music. They would get up on a Saturday, rapidly fill these things out with whatever they remembered, and then send them in. So everything was wrong, but everybody was happy. And then in around 2010, Arbitron introduced this product. It's called the Personal Performance Meter, or PPM. And the PPM is a small pager-sized device that sits on your hip. And every radio station would play a signal that you couldn't hear. It was out of human hearing, but this device could hear it. And as a result, the device knew exactly what radio station you were listening to, whether you liked it or not. So if you walked into a shopping center and they were playing country music, even though you didn't claim to be a country music fan, this little device knew that for those 15 minutes or 30 minutes, you were listening to country music. Something else happened, which is not only were people being honest because they had no choice, but they were delivering this data every day. They'd get home, and when they charged this little device, it would send the information back with timestamps to the radio stations. And this completely transformed the music industry, because now the radio station not only knew what you were really listening to, but it knew what songs made you stick around and what songs made you leave. So with honest, accurate information that nobody was messing with, the entire radio industry changed. Radio stations that had a 50% market share collapsed down to 20 or 30% because they weren't really holding those listeners. In fact, there was a class action lawsuit in Los Angeles by those community radio stations because they were effectively becoming defunded. So this is a really good example of what happens when you get abundant, accurate data into a system. And I think that the Arbitron example and what it did to the radio industry is a canary in the coal mine for what's happening to many other industries today. One of the most interesting consequences of this is, in the old days, when a song was popular, it would be in what was called heavy rotation. The DJs would play it all the time, people would call in and request it, and that song would do well. So if a Britney Spears song in 2007 was very popular, well, that song would get played on average 6 times a day. Once we knew what songs made people tune in and what songs made them leave, those songs were played on average 26 times a day. That's more than once an hour. And the reason is that the radio stations knew that by playing those songs, you stuck around. But what we saw was a shift in the frequency and the duration of pop songs. So what would happen is a new song would come out, you'd hear it interminably, and then all of a sudden it would go away. And this shaped how music was produced, what songs people chose to portray, and so on. Another example of applying data to a startup or a problem comes from a conference I spoke at called Lean UX. So analyzing data is one thing and getting accurate information is another. But when we apply it to the lean startup method of thinking, we get really good results. The lean startup model is based on this idea that you should identify the riskiest thing and do that first, because that's the way to have the greatest chance of long-term success. So this conference back in 2015 sent me a mail. Hey, Alistair, would you come and speak? And I said, sure, the book has recently come out. I'd be happy to do that. They said, we'll pay for your airfare and we'll pay for your hotel and we'll pay for a bottle of good scotch. So I asked them what kind of scotch it was. They assured me it would be reasonably good. And I said, yes. I asked the organizers how they had gone about running this conference, because I want to ask you all, type this in a chat. What is the riskiest thing about running a conference? If you're running an in-person conference, go ahead and type in chat. What do you think is the riskiest thing about running a conference? I'm going to check and make sure you're all running. Weather, that's a good one. No one shows up, says Christina. Christina, you're absolutely right. The biggest risk is that nobody actually shows. You don't want to run a conference and have nobody in the seats, because the speakers will be miserable and the attendees will feel like they made a bad decision, and the sponsors won't like it. So what's the first thing that most conferences do when they're launching? Go ahead and type that into chat. What's the first thing most conferences do when they are trying to launch a new conference? Advertising, registration. Yeah, so they sell tickets, they start promoting the thing. Usually they promote the speakers, and often before that, they pick a date and a location. And so is there any real risk to picking a date or a location? Realistically, there's no risk there. So what Lean UX did is they took a step back and said, let's run a conference based on Lean startup principles. If the biggest risk is attendance, how do you know you have an audience? So what they did is they said, if we can start a mailing list and get 1,000 people on it, we'll move to the next step. And when we get 1,000 people, we will then ask people if they want to buy a ticket without charging their credit card. It'll be a conditional purchase. They'll say, hey, we're going to sell tickets. And if 300 people buy this provisional ticket, we'll bill your credit cards and we'll have a conference. So they did this. They ran the mailing list. They grew the audience. They convinced themselves that they had a good audience, promoted this event saying, look, we're going to run a conference on Lean UX. It'll be somewhere near New York City within 25 miles, and it'll be somewhere around this date. And people said, yes, I'm in, and they bought tickets. So they had 300 tickets. So then the next riskiest thing was, will anyone speak? And so, because they could still refund the money and not have incurred any costs. So they mailed me and a few other people. And when they found that we would in fact agree to speak for free and a bottle of scotch, then they said, okay, we now have a conference. Here's the lineup. They started selling the lineup to other people. They went to sponsors and said, we've already got 300 people confirmed. They had another 400 register. Then they said, okay, we've got about 700 attendees. Let's go find a venue that can accommodate 700 attendees. And once they had 700 attendees signed up, they said, okay, this is where we're doing it. They gave people 48 hours to cancel their ticket if they couldn't make it. And about 5% of people said, oh, I can't make that time in that location. So now they had around 700 attendees confirmed, billed, and they were able to go to sponsors and say, do you want to meet these 700 attendees? Here's their demographics. And they ran the conference with great success. This is a really good example of what Lean Startup suggests. Identify the riskiest thing first, and then de-risk that before you move forward. Because there's an old myth that Silicon Valley loves failure. It doesn't love failure. It just prefers it to the alternative, which is doing something nobody wants. That's why we say fail fast. It's not that we want failure. It's that we want to get to success quickly, and we want to identify whether or not the biggest risks can be overcome. So I want you to keep those two things in your head as we go through this presentation today. First, that data has to be accurate and collected in real time, and it can absolutely change an industry if it does. And the second thing is, find out what the riskiest thing is first and de-risk that. Those are the two sort of fundamental principles behind Lean analytics. The Lean startup movement was really started by someone named Steve Blank. And Steve Blank, who can be considered the sort of godfather of the Lean startup movement, he's a lecturer at Stanford, said, a startup is an organization formed to search for a sustainable, repeatable business model. If you're running a hair salon, you're not a startup. You may be an entrepreneur, but your business model is known, and you're just parroting that business model and trying to execute better. A new kind of business model, something that tackles a new market or introduces a new product or has a new go-to-market method, that's a startup. And that's why in the early stages, a startup founder is sort of scribbling around trying to figure out what to do. There's a lot of experimentation and false starts. But as long as you're learning and gradually moving in the right direction, you will get to this mythical thing called product market fit, which is where you've decided on the right product for the right market. And then the job is to execute. And this is why so often startups replace their initial leaders once they found it with someone who can execute on that, because the skill set to discover a product for a market is very different from the skill set to execute on that delivery. Now, there's several ways that we have built software and even things like battleships over the years. The first is what we call the waterfall approach. And this works great when you know the problem and the solution. If you're trying to land on Mars, you don't get to do MVPs and iterative starts. You have to get it right the first time. And so there's an incredible amount of complexity that goes on in testing to make sure that this thing will work the first time. It requires an immense amount of planning. And this works very well when you know the requirements, land on Mars, and you know how to satisfy them with parachutes and rockets and so on. And so you build a very detailed specification, and then you test it out, and then you launch the thing, and it better work. Of course, this is not how the real world behaves, because those requirements may have changed or vanished entirely. And so you may build and design for something, but by the time you hit the market 3 or 4 years later, it's too late and the world has changed. So in response to this, we came up with an approach called Agile. Agile says, I know the problem I'm trying to solve, but I need to find a solution that works. And so it's a recognition that by doing things in shorter sprints and iterations, you will do better. If you're Amazon, for example, and you want to increase readership on the Kindle, you have a known set of requirements, which is get more readers, but it's unclear what's going to work. And so you come up with a problem statement. We want to get readership up. And then you build on that product statement. And then you test it. And if it's not quite working, you say, is it viable yet? And you keep iterating and adjusting until you have the thing that you want to launch. The risk here is that those requirements you thought you knew, it turns out were unknown. You thought you were building to solve one problem, but you actually solved another. And so startups have to be much more opportunistic. They have to say, I'm willing to change not just how I satisfy a problem, but what problem I'm satisfying as the market teaches me more about what's going on. And so this is where the lean startup approach comes from. And it's a very Zen-like approach. The question is, how do I know that I don't know what's going on? How do I have this Zen-like conviction that my startup's a great idea while also dealing with the constant doubt and second guessing of being willing to change? And generally we do this by saying, okay, I have a possible problem space. And this is where your startup idea might be. This is where your new business idea is. But then you come up with a product market hypothesis. I think that if I build this thing for this market, it will work. And you iterate through these things as you learn more and more. And these iterations are called pivots. And a pivot isn't simply flailing around. It's taking something you learned from one launch or one trial and applying it to the next so you get closer and closer. In fact, this is the core of the lean startup movement. It's this idea of iteration. You start out with an idea, you build something, you turn it into a product, you launch the product into the market, you measure what happens, you collect that data, you learn from it, and then you come up with a new idea. The problem with this is that we're all liars. And I don't mean to be rude. It's early in the morning here, and that sounds a little snarky, but we are ultimately all liars because when we have these ideas, we love them. We're so convinced that our idea is the best. And so we build a thing, and that's what we like doing the most. Whether you're editing pixels or writing code, this is the thing over which you have 100% control. It's very comfortable. It's very safe. It's a lot of fun, but it doesn't really de-risk the problem. And so we launched the product without really measuring it, partly because we were strapped for time, so we didn't put in the proper analytics, and partly because we don't want to know. And so when it comes time to learn, we aren't actually collecting the data from the product. So this is a fundamental problem, and that's what Lean Startup is trying to address. Most startups have no idea what they're going to be when they grow up. I've been collecting examples of this over the years, and they're all pretty funny. PayPal was initially a way for people to beam money from one Palm Pilot to another using infrared. FreshBooks, which I use for invoicing, was a web design firm that got fed up with making its own invoices. Wikipedia was initially going to be written by 1,000 paid librarians, and then it turned out to be a crowdsourcing model. Mitel, which is a pretty big telecommunications company in Canada, was a lawnmower company. And the proof of that is in the name. It was started by Michael Copeland and Terry Matthews, and the name means Mike and Terry's lawnmowers. So they definitely changed. Hotmail was initially a database company. The only reason there was a web-based email was that the two founders were trying to cheat on their current employers by setting up a web portal that they could send emails from. And when they went to present their database idea to Draper Fisher Jurvetson, I think it was Don Draper, not Don Draper, one of the VCs there, said, I don't like your database idea. Tell me more about the email system. Flickr, the film and picture company, where you host all your videos online and all your pictures online, that's now owned by by Yahoo, was going to be a massively multiplayer online game. People were going to play a game in the real world and upload photographs as part of the game. And then they realized that it was much more useful as a photo sharing site. In fact, the founders of that company sold it, and now they were all fairly well off and distributed. So they were going to launch the game company that they'd always wanted to build, but they first needed a tool to allow them to chat during the day, and that became Slack. So all we know about the founders of Flickr and Slack is that they can't really successfully build a video game. Twitter was a podcasting company. Autodesk made desktop automation. This is a constant pattern where startups don't actually know what they're going to be, but if they're paying attention and they're learning from the market, they can pivot and adapt. And the way you learn from the market is data, of course. So what data should you look at? I'm going to ask you another question. If you're running a hair salon, what is the biggest problem you face? There's lots of things about running a hair salon. If you're the owner of a hair salon, type in a chat. What do you think is the biggest problem that your audience faces, that your business faces? You don't have to type it once, but I'm going to wait for at least one response. If you're running a hair salon, what is the biggest problem you face? Finding a suitable time for an appointment, risk of damaging their image, customers, not all customers are the same, lack of repeat business. So it's definitely the empty chair. And I know this because I sat down and asked a hair salon owner once, and she said, yeah, she was complaining about the staff being difficult and the merchandise being expensive and so on. I said, wouldn't all of these problems be fixed if you could predict when your customers were coming in and have exactly the right supply for that demand? And she said, yeah, I would. And I said, well, what would you build to do that? And she starts going off with these ideas. Oh, I wish there was an app that when one of my customers was within 2 miles and I had an empty seat, it would send them a notification and calendaring. And she started getting really angry that these solutions didn't exist. And I said, you've just changed from being a hair salon owner to being a startup founder, because you're identifying the biggest risk and then trying to figure out how to de-risk it. And the good news is that analytics can help with this. Companies that invest in data-driven decisions instead of firing from the hip, which is what most small businesses still do, have a 5 to 6% higher level of productivity and profits than their competitors each year. Now think about that. If you compound that over several years, you are now incredibly profitable and your competitors are obsolete. Analytics could roughly be defined as the measurement of movement toward your business goals. And that means that in a startup, the purpose of analytics is to iterate towards product market fit before the money or your own patience or the patience of your investors runs out. So let's talk about a few fundamentals to do with metrics. I'm going to give you 4 examples or 4 things that you need to ask yourself whenever you have a metric. And if you use these rules, you'll be vastly better at data than anybody else is already. This will already make you far ahead of the game. The first thing is that a metric must be understandable. More time explaining your metrics to your audience means less time deciding and using those metrics to make good business decisions. I like to say that a good metric should be no more complicated than a golf score. We understand golf. I say, get into the hole in 4 strokes. If you get in 3, that's good. 5, that's bad. If you look at games like bowling, the scoring system is opaque and confusing, and you spend time explaining it. So metrics should be no more complicated than a golf score. The second thing is they should be comparative. You want to compare your metric to other times, like what did I do last month, to other actors, what are my competitors up to other goals. So whatever you're doing, your metric has to be comparable. You have to compare to other things. Otherwise, you can't see progress. You can't see where you stand. You can't see how close you're getting to your objectives. The third thing is it should be a ratio or a rate. If I'm driving my car and I tell you that it's going 25 miles per hour or kilometers per hour, then I have explored a tension in there. There's distance, which is kilometers, and there's time, which is hours. And a metric like return on investment or miles per hour, anything that has a per or an on, will inform that metric because you're inherently showing the trade-off or the tension between the inputs and the outputs of the organization. And finally, it has to be behavior changing. If you can't tell someone what you will do differently based on the results, you're probably not measuring the right thing. So you have to be able to articulate what it is about the problem you're solving that will allow you to make a better decision. And in fact, this is the simplest rule for analytics of any kind. If a metric won't change how you behave, it's a bad metric. This over and over again is the one rule you need to use to decide when someone says to you, give me the data, whether or not that's worth your time. And you should push back if the person who's asking you can't articulate how that metric will change their behavior, because it means they haven't properly thought through the underlying business problem that metric is going to inform. Metrics will help you to know yourself. Here's a concrete example of that. If you know how many of your customers will buy from you again in 90 days, you can tell a lot about your business. If very few of your customers will buy from you a second time in 90 days, you are what's called an acquisition business. Your customers, most of them will buy from you once, and that's like most retailers. For example, if you're selling a wedding ring, then most of your customers will buy from you once. If you have someone who's showing up and buying a wedding ring every week, something else is going on. They're probably not a typical customer. But if you do this, it means you should focus on no refunds. No, you can't have money back if the wedding gets called off. Low acquisition cost. How do I get lots of customers in here? High checkout, so it's a high priced item. Lots of things to encourage them with sharing it the moment of purchase, selling additional services like jewelry cleaning. That's how you focus if you're an acquisition focused business. On the other hand, if more than 30% of your customers buy from you a second time in 90 days, then you're a loyalty focused company. And that means that your customers are going to buy from you over and over again. That's why pizza stores have things like 30 minutes or it's free. You would never say wedding ring, 30 minutes or it's free, but you would say that for a pizza store, and you care there about loyalty, getting them to come back. You might have loyalty cards, wide selection, inventory on hand, so you can deliver it very quickly. Now, what's amazing here is I've just described a number of things over on the right that really define your business model. And yet very few companies take the time to measure whether their customers buy more than once in 90 days. So here's a good example how a metric that you collect is going to influence very significant business decisions, and most people don't take the time to reflect on them. Some other things you need to know about metrics. Obviously, there are qualitative metrics. When you ask people to give you feedback, it tends to be very unstructured. It tends to be full of anecdotes, but you often find those little insights. And so early on in the business, as you're growing, you can use that for sort of epiphanies or hypotheses you might test. And then you have quantitative metrics. Quantitative metrics are hard numbers. They're digits. They show you metrics. They're easier to add up and roll over and aggregate, but they won't give you that novel insight that you want from qualitative. So you need both of these things. You also have some data that's exploratory, which tends to be speculative. You're trying to find possible insights, new ways of thinking about the business. And this is where the unfair advantages come from. This is where you get those sort of epiphanies that let you understand the business. And then there's also reporting data, which is stuff like what was sales last week? That's very predictable. I know I'm going to need it, but it doesn't really change my business. I only really want to know if sales go up more or are less than what I predicted. That's worth looking at. But simply reporting metrics is stuff that you can assign to your accountant or your team, and then you get alerts when those things are exceeded or violate your expectations. So exploratory metrics are really cool. They're really fun. That's where you get the best ideas. Reporting metrics are necessary. They're dry and they're boring, and they should be automated as much as possible. So that's a few things to think about data. This is probably the most complex and data-centric slide, but I'm going to give you a concrete example of how a startup might think about some of this information. So let's pretend that I've launched a new startup and I've got 1,000 new customers a month trying it out. And in my first month, those 1,000 customers try the product and then they kind of peter out after a little while. They didn't like it so much. It wasn't that great. Their first experience wasn't wonderful. But in February, using what I've learned from that first experience, I launch a new product and it has roughly the same number of people starting, but more of them keep using the product over time, which is encouraging. And by March, I have a bigger launch, more people come in, and I managed to mitigate that drop off. Here's April. And by May, I have a pretty healthy business where I'm acquiring a lot of customers, and those customers are taking less time. They're going away less. They're sticking around more. If I slice this data across the length of it, what's called longitudinally, I'm comparing what's called a cohort. A cohort is a comparison of a similar group along a timeline. So this would be in black here, the April cohort for my users. Now, if I slice across the data this way, which is cross-sectionally, I'm just taking a slice of all the users and a segment of them, and I might actually break that up and say, show me all the users that came in all time, who came in on a sunny day versus a cloudy day. That would be a way to segment those users. And I might also subject them to a test. So maybe I want to show half the users a button that's red and half the users a button that's green and see what happened. And while Google and Facebook can run these kinds of tests in real time because they have so many users, you may actually need to do some statistical stuff like multivariate analysis, where you show different users, different combinations of factors, and you look at which ones correlate the most with the kind of behavior you want, like customer retention or revenue. So when you're looking at data, it's very important to keep these things in mind, cohorts and segments and so on. And so I want to use this as an example, and I'm going to show you two companies, and I want you to tell me which of them is doing better. So here's company A. Get ready to type into chat. Company A is getting 1,000 customers in January and 1,000 in February and 1,000 in March, 1,000 in April, 1,000 in May, 1,000 new customers each month. And their revenue per customer, their average revenue per customer in January is $5 or euros. In February, that drops to 450, then 433, then 425. By May, it starts to come back a little bit to 450. How many people think this company is growing, and how many people think this company is stagnating? Go ahead and type into chat if you think this company is growing or if you think this company is stagnating. So it looks pretty flat. Most people look at this and they're like, yeah, it's stagnating, which is a fairly, I'm going to show you a second company, but this time I'm going to show you the data in a slightly different manner. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the cohorts that we saw earlier to slice up the data. And so let's look at this one here. If I say here is this company has 1,000 users, and those January users spend $5 in the first month, and then they spend $3 in the second month, and $2 in the third month, and $4 in the fourth month, and 50 cents in the fifth month. So in other words, they acquire customers, they start paying $5, but that trickles off. In February, which is the second month, they launch and those customers pay $6. So things are already looking better. And then it drops off less quickly. So it goes to 4, then 2, then 1. By March, it's 7, 6, 5. April, and then May, they're getting $9 in the first month. How many people think this company is growing, and how many people think this company is stagnating? Company is doing terribly and declining. So Pedrick, I'd love to know why you think it's declining. It is, most people would say growing. Of course, I'm playing a trick on you. They are the same company. The difference here is that, and I'll go back to that slide so you can see what I mean. The difference here is that if you look at the average of everybody's first month, what you're doing is you're saying, okay, those users that got $3 in the second month, plus the users that got $6 in the first month, what I'm doing is I'm polluting my better cohorts with the lackluster performance of the previous cohorts. And so if I align it like this, you start to see what's happening here is that I care about first month growth of the cohort. I'm taking the first month revenue of 1,000 new customers from $5 up to $9. Sure, that's an average of $7, but it's increasing. And I'm also fixing the drop off. So by analyzing the data and separating the cohorts, you're not polluting the excellent work you're doing in April with the customers you brought on in January with an admittedly lackluster product and less good experience. And so I actually know a startup founder who went to solicit money from an investor, and he put the data together with averages and was thrown out. And I advised him to put it together as cohorts. He went back in and actually closed an up round because his company was doing quite well. But the way he presented the data didn't demonstrate that because he was muddying the improvement with the history that he had, which was necessary to get him to a place where the technology worked. Another important thing to think about metrics is the difference between a lagging and a leading metric. A lagging metric is historical. It shows you how you're doing. So if I say, this is what sales was, well, that's great, but it shows me all of the things in marketing and sales development and so on and pipeline building that led to that. On the other hand, leading metrics might be forward-looking, a number today that predicts tomorrow. So how good is my sales pipeline? If you have trouble tickets and customer complaints, that might be a leading indicator of cancellation. So it's very important to know if you're looking at lagging metrics, which sort of report the news, or leading metrics, which predict the news. Another thing about data, you may or may not know this, but there is a strong proven correlation between ice cream consumption and drowning. It's a sad fact, but it's true that the more people eat ice cream, the more likely it is that people will drown. So I've often asked people if they would like to ban ice cream as a result in order to save lives. And of course, aside from 1 or 2 lactose intolerant audience members, everybody says that's nonsense because the correlation has to do with time of year. There's more ice cream consumed in the summertime when it's warm, and there are more drowning deaths in the summertime when people go swimming. So this is an important difference to keep in mind. A correlated metric is 2 variables that are related, like ice cream and drowning, but a causal metric is something independent that directly impacts a dependent one. So summertime and drowning. Now, the reason I put these here is that if you can figure out a leading causal metric, that's kind of a superpower. If I know how to do something today that will produce a business outcome I want later on, then I can focus on doing that thing today and change the outcome of the business. Some examples of this that were brought up in the 2012 growth hacking conference, and you've probably all heard the term growth hacking right now. I have a lot of opinions on that, but I don't want to get into them right now, is that many of the large social networks and gaming companies that you're familiar with today know what it takes to get you started. So they know what to do to get you interested in the business in the first place. For example, if you reach 7 friends within 10 days of signing up on Facebook, you're likely to become a long-term user. If you put at least one file in one folder on one device at Dropbox, you're likely to become a long-term user of Dropbox. And so this is things that these companies know about the early user experience that lead, because there is a causal relationship, they lead to beneficial outcomes later on. Companies go to great lengths to analyze this stuff. SoundCloud, for example, I got this from Corey Levinson at SoundCloud, knows exactly how likely you are to come back based on how many people you follow on the platform and what probability you have, and how many songs you listen to. So SoundCloud will do everything it can to try and get you to play a song when you're on the platform and follow more people when you're on the platform. If you do these things, you're much more likely to become a loyal returning user. And they care about loyal returning users. So they do everything they can in their power during the onboarding to get you to connect to new people and play some songs. And this absolutely drives how products are designed. For example, at Twitter, one of the lessons there was a user who follows 10 people who follow her back in the first 7 days will become a loyal customer. If you didn't know this, you might build Twitter in the following way. The user would sign up, you would suggest some people for them to follow that they will like, and the user would follow them. That's it. But they're probably not going to become a long-term user. On the other hand, if the suggestion algorithm doesn't just suggest users you'll like, but some of them are people who are likely to follow you back, to reciprocate that follow, and you follow them and get the follow back, you become a loyal customer. So products build this kind of behavior in to reinforce the behaviors that are leading indicators of long-term good outcomes, profitability, retention, and so on. I had this experience myself. I was staying overseas and the hotel was wonderful. I'd never used TripAdvisor. And so they said, would you please write us a review on TripAdvisor? And I was in Budapest. I said, sure. I wrote them a review. And a few days later, I get this message saying, hey, you're in the top 25%. Okay. I mean, it doesn't mean anything to me. It says my review has had 331 readers. That could just be because they stuck it on their homepage. This doesn't tell me anything, but my initial reaction was, wow, you really like me. And of course, TripAdvisor controls all of this experience. So maybe, and I'm not saying they do this, but maybe they have a hypothesis that says if Alistair thinks that people will like his reviews, he will write more of them sooner. So if they just said, if I just wrote a review and people read the review, that would be the end of it. But if they display reviews from new users more often on sites and tell them that their review is popular, then the user writes more reviews. So all of this data isn't just used in a board meeting to make a business decision. It's also used in product design to shape the way the product works. So that's a little bit about the background of analytics. And now I want to jump to lean analytics itself. Lean analytics is essentially using data to de-risk and iterate more quickly than you would otherwise do. The first question here is, how do we get growth? Eric Ries, who wrote the book, The Lean Startup, which is kind of the companion to what lean analytics does, says that sustainable growth comes from the actions of your customers. If you wake up every day and you close sales and you work hard, but if you were hit by a bus, the company would stop, you don't have sustainable growth because that growth is dependent on how much you put into it. And Eric says there are 3 distinct ways to get sustainable growth. The first is stickiness. If you have customers that come in and they stick around because they like the product, they become loyal, then your work to grow the business will pay off over time because eventually you'll have more recurring revenue from sticky customers than it costs you to get up in the morning and run the business. So the first engine of sustainable growth is stickiness. The second one is virality, and I apologize for the decidedly pre-COVID screenshot. But virality is simply that when a customer likes you, they tell other customers, they do some of your marketing for you. And of course, we care not only about how many people they tell, but how quickly those people then follow up on that action, how quickly that cycle, the virtuous cycle of virality repeats. And then the third engine of sustainable growth is called revenue. Simply put, if I bring in enough money that I can spend some of that on a sales team or advertising, and I can spend some of that money getting more customers profitably, then I have a form of sustainable growth. So Eric says there's these 3 engines of growth in any startup. The first engine of growth is stickiness, which simply says, please keep people coming back. And the math that matters here is, am I getting customers faster than I lose them? Am I acquiring new customers and new revenue faster than I am losing it to churn? Virality simply says, can I get people to invite their friends or their colleagues? And the math here is how many people they invite and how fast they tell them, and how many of those lead to proper registrations or purchases. And finally, there's price, which is spending money to get customers. And the question here is, when I spend money to acquire a customer, are they worth more than they cost? Now, Ben Yoskovitz, who wrote the book with me, believe very strongly in this stuff, but we also are unabashed thieves. So we went and stole these 3 ideas with Eric's permission and made them part of the book. Another person we quoted in the book is a guy named Dave McClure. Dave was the founder of 500 Startups, and he has what he calls pirate metrics. Pirate metrics basically says that there are 5 stages to the customer lifecycle. It starts with acquisition of the customer, just simply finding out that they're out there and getting them to look at you. Activation, which means they try the thing, they start using it. Retention, which means they keep coming back. Referral, which means they tell other people. And revenue, which means they extract some money from you. And as you can tell, the name Pirate Metrics comes from the acronym of acquisition, activation, retention, referral, and revenue, which is R. Now, it's early and it's boring, so I'm going to tell you a joke. Does anybody know what a pirate's favorite letter is? Go ahead and type it in chat. What's a pirate's favorite letter? You're probably all groaning and fed up with this joke, but I promise you it's worth it. What is a pirate's favorite letter? Christina says R. You'd think so, but me first love was the C. You're welcome. You can use that on your kids. So we took Dave, you can groan in chat if you feel like you should. Dave McClure's basic idea was great, but he's not a great artist. So we kind of cleaned this up a bit. We said acquisition, which is how your users become aware of you. This is how you go find them, how you use search engines and widgets and email and PR and whatever to make them aware that you're out there and get them to come to your site or your product. Then there's activation, which is like, okay, I now know you exist. What am I going to do to turn you into a paid user? And so that's how the second part works. And then there is retention. The question there is, does a one-time user become engaged? Once I've activated, I've tried out the product, can I get them to keep coming back through alerts, through notifications, through reminders, through calendar events, updates, and so on? And finally, we get to the important part, which is revenue. Do they pay bills? Which may be a transaction, a subscription, clicks, analytics, whatever. And then referral. Do they promote the product to other people with likes and tweets and shares and campaigns? So we took Dave's work and we took all the models of the lean startup, Sean Ellis's work and Eric Ries's work, and we kind of put them into this chart. And we talk about the 5 stages of lean analytics. And this is true for almost any analytical effort you have. The first stage is empathy. Can you find a real, poorly met need that a reachable market faces? And those words are chosen very precisely. You may find a real need, but people already have a solution for it. That's not so good. You may find a solution for a real problem, but it's impossible to reach the market. And you may find a need that the market isn't facing, so like you'd have to spend money to convince it that need is real. The perfect problem is a real poorly met need that a reachable market faces. Once you've identified that, then you want to get to stickiness. I've got a solution, and when people try it, they keep using it. That's super important because I don't want to spend money on an advertising campaign until I know that when I throw that at the wall, it'll stick. The next stage is virality. Will they tell their friends? Why would you go for virality before you start trying to get revenue? The reason is pretty clear. Before you start spending money on acquiring people with ads or hiring salespeople, you want to make sure that every lead you get is the best lead possible. And a lead that invites their friends is a much better lead. So once you've figured out that poorly met need and you know that people will use it, then you need to try and find out how much they will tell their friends, because when you step on the gas, when you inject money in the form of advertising and sales, the revenue will multiply by how viral your product is. You want to maximize the chance that every one of those customers sticks around and tells their friends. So you're using the users and the features to fuel growth, both organically, because it's a good product, but also artificially by spending money. And then finally, you get to the scale stage. And this is usually where you bring in an executive to execute on things because you found a sustainable, scalable business with decent margins in a healthy ecosystem. Now, these sound very easy, but they're very, very hard to do. I would say 1 in 10 startups actually gets to the revenue stage. And that's okay if you're de-risking things to learn very quickly and being iterative. Most of the startups that pay attention to this stuff and try and learn do well. And the ones that just blindly stumble ahead and scale prematurely are the ones that face the biggest challenges. So it's not enough to know the 5 stages you're at. You actually need to look at the business model archetypes. What is your business model? Now, everybody's business model is a little different. So for the book, we just wrote down 6 of them. And these 6 are pretty common models that you can then build on. On the left-hand side, you can see e-commerce and two-sided markets. Both of these make money from a transaction. In e-commerce, I sell you something and I get money from it. In a two-sided market, a buyer and a seller come together and I take a percentage of that transaction. The middle 2 generally are on subscription or consumption-based models. So software as a service or mobile apps. In some cases, you're giving the app away for free and selling DLC. In the case of cloud computing, you're selling a consumption charge of how much compute they use. In software as a service, you may be selling per seat per month. And on the right-hand side, these models make money from advertising. So user-generated content like Reddit is where the user generates the content. Media sites where someone writes the content are a different model. But in both cases, you make money from advertising and analytical data and so on. So you need to know what business you're in, as well as what stage you're at, to decide which metrics to measure and how to move forward. One of the best tools that I found in Lean Analytics is this idea of the customer lifecycle. And so this diagram shows you roughly, can you move people through the cycle to make more money than you spend? And your first step is to acquire customers, as we saw from Dave McClure's Power Metrics. And then you activate those customers, you get them engaged and trying out the product, you retain those customers, you get revenue from them, and you make them refer others. And those 5 steps, I'm going to show you what they look like in a bit of an eye chart. This is the customer lifecycle diagram for software as a service. And you can see in this diagram that we have a number of different things in the diagram. I'm going to try and highlight them a bit so you can see them properly. Over here, we have the user coming in, and they might come in from paid or from word of mouth or from other different sources. And then that user signs up and starts trying the product out. And they're either disengaged or engaged. If they're disengaged, I might be able to reactivate them. I might be able to bring them back in. And at some point, if they're an engaged user, they might get bored, they might go away. And then, hey, they just stop using the thing entirely, or they abandon their trial. At some point, I say, okay, your trial's over, or it's time for you to buy the product because you hit a feature you need. And so at this point, they become a paid customer. And the paid customer, hopefully, you're going to continue to upsell them by adding things to the capacity limit. So I'm going to clean up the diagram here just a bit so you can see this better. So over here, once they're a paid customer, what I want to do is take that paid customer and I want to upsell them to new tiers. You want to add a seat or add some new features. I want to avoid them becoming disengaged or dissatisfied. And then if they do become disengaged, I want to reactivate them. If they do become dissatisfied, I want to resolve their problem so they're happy. But eventually their billing information might expire or they might cancel their account, and this is called churn, and they become former customers. And during that time, either when they're trying the product or when they're a paid customer, they might invite other people. Now, what you'll notice about this diagram is that when you see each of these arrows, there's a word next to it. So here's paid conversion or trial abandonment rate or support data. These are the metrics that we care about. And so this diagram is really just a visual representation of the spreadsheet every startup builds. Where do I get my customers from? How much traffic are they going to generate? How many of them are going to sign up? How many of the ones that sign up are going to become paying customers? How much of those customers are going to pay? How many others will they tell? How many of them will churn out because they're unsatisfied or because their business stops? Normally, I would put this in a spreadsheet, but making it visual like this is an incredibly useful exercise. In fact, I've done consulting work where I went on site to a client, and this was in Washington, D.C. I flew down there. I spent a day doing this with them, and at the end of the day, they said, we can't even agree on what our business model diagram looks like. So they spent a week, And they tried to figure it out, and they called me back, and they were very proud. And they said, okay, we figured it out. We finally come to agreement. It was a really useful exercise. I said, okay, what are the metrics that you want to change? And they said, what do you mean? I said, well, what are the labels for all the arrows in your diagram? And they thought for a while, and they said, oh, you have to come back next week. So I came back for a third week, and they said, well, great news. We figured out all the metrics. I said, okay, what are they? Where are they right now? And they said, well, we don't actually have most of this data. And the ones that we have got, we realized that they're on fire and absolutely broken. And so it took 3 meetings for them to come to terms with what their business model looked like, what the metrics they needed to track to understand their business model were, and where the sort of line in the sand for good enough was for each of those metrics versus what it needed to be for them to grow. Now, this is one example of a diagram like this. In the book, there are 6 of them. As I mentioned, there's 6 business model archetypes. And so I'm not going to expect you to look at all these things, but it's being recorded. So hopefully you can see these, and some of them are available online. This is an e-commerce customer lifecycle. So very similar model. But in here, you can see that I've got, up here, I've got this sort of e-commerce customer lifecycle of people coming in to the store. They go and look at recommendations. Sorry about that. They go and look at recommendations. They do search. They put things in their cart. Sometimes they abandon their cart. Eventually, they convert to a paid customer. There's some logistics for sales and delivery. Hopefully, they're satisfied. If I'm a loyalty-focused business, then I want them to enroll and sign up and get more notifications so they keep coming back. If I'm acquisition-focused, then I want them to share. And if they're not social, they don't share. And this is kind of a diagram for that business model. But again, every one of your businesses is going to be different. So the key here is to take from each of these diagrams and build something that works for you, that's an amalgam of them. Amazon, for example, has a review process for books, which is sort of like user-generated content. They have Amazon Marketplace, which is a marketplace model. They have e-commerce, which is a transaction model, and so on. We saw the software as a service workflow that I mentioned earlier, but there's one for mobile apps, and there's one for media, and there's one for two-sided marketplaces, and for user-generated content. And again, those are a lot to digest. It doesn't make sense to go through them in detail now, but know that your job is to build a diagram for your business informed by those kinds of models. And the reason I care about this is that now we're looking at the model plus the stage, which gives you the one metric that matters to your business. So we mentioned earlier that there are 6 different business model archetypes in the book. We also mentioned that there's these 5 stages. If you know what stage you're at and you know what business model you're in, you should be able to figure out what one metric matters the most to your business. So if you're at the virality stage in a software as a service business model, what's the one metric that matters the most to you? When we said that you should look at one metric, a lot of people questioned Ben and I. They said, really, just one metric? And we said, yes, one metric, because in a startup, focus is really hard to achieve. And if you have only one metric, this addresses the underlying problem. Because if you think about parking a car, your car has speedometers and gas lights and electricity and all these kinds of things that could interrupt you. There's thousands of metrics that your body is taking in as you're driving a car. The vibration of the wheel, the position of your hands, the gravitational or accelerational forces on your body, the sound of other vehicles, all the things you see in your mirror and your windshield. There's tons of metrics. But if you're trying to park your car, the only metric that matters is how far am I from the thing behind me? Obviously, if there are other problems, then the light will come on and you'll check your fuel. But it's really important to focus on the one metric that matters to your business at that time, because focus is the scarcest resource in any startup. For example, when SEO Moz, which was a fast-growing SEO company, got more advisors and got more money, Brad Feld joined the board. He's a well-known investor and entrepreneur. And he said, we want to cut down the number of metrics. We want to focus on what he called net adds. So the board meeting, they just had one metric, which was, what's the net adds? How many customers do we add minus the ones we lost each quarter? If the net adds went up, then the board would say, was marketing a successful campaign? Did customer complaints go down? Was the product better? If they were flat, what can we do about that? Can we acquire better customers? Can we increase engagement or improve our support? And if it went down, are we targeting the wrong customers so they left? Did a campaign not work? Is customer support breaking? Did a product not work? They focused on just one metric that became the sort of North Star metric for the organization. And the reason we think it's okay to focus on one metric that matters is because metrics are like squeeze toys. Once you optimize a metric, the next metric just bulges out. If you're optimizing web traffic, the next metric should be conversions. If you're optimizing conversions, then the next metric is going to be returns or complaints. And this problem allows you to keep iterating the riskiest metric and overcoming it. So if you take all of these 5 stages and you take all of these 6 business models, you get a lot of very complicated metrics that you could track. But in order to save you all the time of doing so, you can just go, and I will type this into chat. You can go to bit.ly/ and it's got to be capitalized because it's case sensitive, big lean table, and you will open up a 2 or 3 page PDF that has details on the metrics you need for each stage and each business model. And so you can go into that and look at what metrics you should be tracking. If you know what stage your startup is at and you know which business model you're in, that'll give you a good idea for what metrics you should track. So now you know what makes a good metric, and you have a rough idea of what lean analytics is, which is this idea of measuring the riskiest metric according to the stage you're at and the business model you're in, and then optimizing that metric. But how do you know what good enough is? Well, we call this drawing a line in the sand. If I tell you that a company loses a quarter of its customers every year, how many of you think that's good or bad? Go ahead and type in chat whether you think that's good or bad. A company loses a quarter of its customers. It's a subscription company, loses a quarter of its customers every year. Is that good or bad? So Rita says neither. Everybody, so there's a lot of debate here. The reality, of course, it sounds pretty bad, but you need to know a lot more. It's a good point, Christina. If revenue per customer goes up, so you're absolutely right, Mafalda. The question here is, are you getting more customers? So a baseline for startups is something called churn. The best software as a service companies in the world get 1.5 to 3% a month of churn. We spoke to the owner of a WordPress hosting site who was getting 2% a month churn. And he was furious and he did everything he could. And then he went to talk to other people and they said, "You're getting 2% a month. That's fantastic. Can we buy you?" Because 2% a month churn, which is 24% a year, is very, very low. And I'll explain why that is in a minute. But if you get to 2% a month churn and you're growing, that's fantastic. And there are tricks that companies employ all the time. Facebook, if you ever try to leave Facebook, gives you a little message saying these people will miss you. And that alone reduces the departure rate by 7%. But companies that get this good, they get to 24% a year or 2% a month, have multiple PhDs working full-time on the job of churn reduction. Not knowing what normal is makes you do dumb things. That founder who was getting 2% a month churn should have been focusing on some other metric because that metric was just fine, but he didn't have the context to know it was good. Another good example of a baseline for growth is you should be growing as a startup 5 to 7% a week. If you can't sustain a 5% growth rate in the early months of your startup, that is a strong signal that there are not enough people who really care enough to sustain your growth. Now, you shouldn't do this at the expense of understanding your customers. In the empathy stage, it doesn't matter so much. But as you start to get into virality and stickiness, you need to know you can get to this. Either your customers or your revenue should grow at 5% a week. A week, that's a pretty daunting number, but that is the signal that you found a product market fit that will actually take it off. And if you haven't, you should probably consider another business model. There's some other metrics that have held true for years and years. If you're running a website, you'll probably see 10% of your users a day on the app, 30% of your users using the app each month, and 1% of your users per day using it concurrently. And this ratio has held out for about 20 years. Now, I mentioned earlier about churn. Let me explain a little bit more about that. If you have 25% a month churn, that means that out of 100 customers, a quarter of them leave every month. So you lose 25 customers out of your 100. That means you burn through your 100 customers in 4 months, and the average customer lasts 4 months. That would be 25% monthly churn. 5% monthly churn, you lose 5% of your 100 customers every month. It takes 20 months to burn through all your customers. That's 20 months. 2% monthly churn means the average customer lasts 50 months. That's roughly 4 years, which is quite a long time if you think about it. Your credit card number probably changes. You might change jobs in that time. So it's entirely feasible that you will see a churn of 2% a month. So what does that tell you? Because again, these metrics should change our behavior. Well, if you're trying to spend money acquiring customers, which we call the customer acquisition cost, we care about the customer acquisition cost in as much as it costs us less than the value of the customer. Remember I said that you have to be able to acquire customers for less money than they make you? First of all, you're going to lie to yourself when you say it's cheap to acquire customers and they will stick around. In the early days of your company, you can't possibly know whether someone will stick around for 4 years. So the rule of thumb is look at what your customer's lifetime value is, what they're worth to you over their lifetime, and spend less than 1/3 of that amount acquiring them. This is important because if I'm spending money to acquire a customer, I'm essentially loaning the customer money that I expect to earn back over their lifetime. And so this forces you to verify that those customers are really profitable. So here's an example of how to think about that. If I know that my customers have a lifetime of 20 months, meaning I have a 5% a month churn, I know that those customers are going to stick around on average for 20 months. And let's say that I get $30 a month per customer. Well, then I know that my customer lifetime value is $600 on average. And knowing that I can only spend 1/3 of it, I can spend $200 to acquire my customer. That's my customer acquisition cost. Now, if you've been paying attention, what you want to do is go figure out, is there something about the customers that stick around longer that's more valuable? Perhaps they're all parents. Perhaps they all live in Europe. And once I've identified the segment that is more likely to stick around longer and have a customer lifetime value that's higher, I want to go target those users. So you don't just blindly throw money, you try and find the segments that are most likely to be the most lucrative once you invest acquisition money in them. Christina, these things are applicable across all industries if you're looking at the chart I showed you. So a consumable product would be something like a SaaS model, which is subscription. Whereas if someone's buying something transactionally that they replace under a certain amount of time, like toothpaste from an e-commerce site, you would use a different set of metrics there. Sean, when we're talking about years, generally speaking, we look at the customer lifetime value and we say monthly churn calculated by annual lifetime. So normally if you're saying 25% a month in churn, then you would figure out that's 4 months or 1/3 of a year total. So usually when we're talking about customer lifetime value, we talk about it monthly, but you could also talk about it weekly or whatever metric you have depending on the data that you're crunching. This is also a little more complex than it might seem. I'm going to show you 2 users here. This is user A, and in the time of this user, they have visited 8 times. So this is today over on the right, and you can think about this as a chart going from left to right. So the left-hand side is the first time that users A and B have appeared. User B visited the site 4 times. User A visited the site 8 times. And then a little while ago, we stopped hearing from either of them. And we're asking ourselves today, which of these users is worth more? Both of them have spent $200 in their lifetime. So I want you in chat to type in which of the 2 users you think is worth more and why. Is user A, who's visited 8 times and then gone dark, worth more? They spent $200 in their lifetime so far. Or is user B, who's only visited 4 times in that time period and then gone dark, worth more? Rita, let's assume that there is no cost or a negligible cost per transaction. They're just visiting the site. So A, Christina says A because they're more engaged. Mafalda says B because they're spending more per visit. B says higher return. So you're absolutely right that B does spend $50 a visit on average, whereas A spends $25 a visit on average. So this is a little tricky. Roberto Medri, and thank you for your answers. It's nice to see people are engaged. It makes me feel less alone. This is a little tricky because Roberto Medri, who did this research at Etsy, would say that it's user B. And I will explain why in a second. What is the chance that user A got hit by a bus versus user B? Because user A used to show up all the time and they suddenly ghosted you. What is the chance that user B is just they're about to return tomorrow, but they haven't been around. So you have to look at the recency and frequency of the visits in the past to predict whether a user will return or stop returning. User A is more likely to have ghosted you than user B. And so it's probably easier to get user B back, and they will spend more money and they're likely to return. So strangely enough, user B is more valuable. Although I have had people say that user A is valuable for an early stage startup because you're able to experiment with them more and learn from them more because they had more visits. So there's a value to each visit in testing your site. But generally speaking, for Etsy, they consider user B more valuable because that user is less likely to have vanished or become satisfied or switched providers. So the question I have for many of you that you should be thinking about right now is, what is your one metric that matters? For your startup, for your business, for whatever you're doing, what is the one metric based on the stage you're at and the business model you're in that matters to your business? So what do you do about that metric? Well, once you've chosen it, you do something we call the lean analytics cycle. And this cycle is really just science, but I'll explain it here anyway. You pick a metric you care about. Maybe that's churn, maybe that's revenue per customer, maybe that's number of posts that someone puts on your site. And you go, okay, I'm going to draw a line in the sand. I need churn to get below 5%. I need every user to do one post a day. You find a potential improvement, and that could just be a good guess. You wake up in the morning and go, I think I'm going to make the site blue. Or it could be something where you have data and say, I noticed that all the people that do this belong to a certain demographic or have a certain type of computer. But whatever that is, you've got a hypothesis that says that this thing is going to produce the result I want and change the KPI in the way I need. If you're lucky, or you're an early stage startup, you make changes in production. If you are a little more constrained, you can design some kind of test to find out what's going to happen. But either way, you measure the results of that and you ask yourself, did we move the needle? Did we make the change we wanted to see? And there are 4 possibilities. The first one, wonderful. You made the change you wanted. The KPI is moved. It's time to go on to the next metric. What's the next metric that matters? Now you've de-risked that one. Second possibility is that, no, it didn't work and we've run out of patience or money and we give up or we change our business model substantially because we've learned that this one was a bad idea. The third metric is change the goalposts. And the fourth metric, which is what happens most of the time, is try again. Now, I want to dwell on the change a goalpost one because that sounds kind of like cheating. Oh, we couldn't get the metric to work, so we decided to change the metric to something we liked better. You should never do that unless you've learned something from the customers. There was a startup I was advising that made a tool for parents and kids to manage their household chores. Each day, the parents and the kids would sit down and they would agree on what chores to do, and the kid would do them and they would get stickers and stars, and then they would get rewards. So the founders said their metric was that families need to use the app in the last 3 days to be considered an engaged family. And they said 3 days because they figured people might go away for the weekend, but they were not seeing the engagement they wanted, and they were very upset. And so in a fit of pique and fury, the founder, Kyle, phoned up a few of the customers. And he said, why don't you like my app? And they said, we love your app. We use it every Saturday morning to plan the week's chores. By the way, why did you make it so hard for us to go into each individual day and set chores? We just want to do it once for the week. Now, Kyle had a reason to draw a new line in the sand because he'd realized that the metric he was using was not an accurate metric of engagement for his target customer. And he also had insights that let them change the usability of the product and the interface to make it more convenient for users. So it's only okay to draw a new line in the sand when the customer gives you permission to do so. And that usually comes with learning about the product. Now, I'll give you a concrete example of this kind of thing in action. Airbnb once asked a question: do Airbnb hosts get more business and more revenue if their property is professionally photographed? So they had this hypothesis that professional photography would help Airbnb's business. They came up with a test, and the test was they hired 20 people to pretend to be Airbnb employees and offered to take photos of hosts' houses professionally for free. They measured the results of that to a control group that didn't have professional photographs. It turned out that houses that were professionally photographed were 2 to 3 times more likely to rent for a decent amount of money, and the revenues grew dramatically. So they made a decision. They launched photography as a feature for all hosts. And by February 2012, they were getting 5,000 photo shoots per month. This is the moment where Airbnb really broke away from other competitors like VRBO and so on. And you can see an example here of the left-hand versus the right-hand side and how much more glorious that looks. Rita, Tristan Cromer has a great approach to set your line in the sand when you don't have enough info. Use the metric that represents the minimum level of comfort you have with your line in the sand. Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. If you are, what is the place where you know that you should shut down your business because it doesn't work? It's a very good, modest way to do it. I think when you have investors, the conversation gets a little more complicated than what Tristan says, because then the investors have opinions about what kind of growth they'd like to see and what growth is necessary to close the next round of investment. So I agree with him as a metric when you're not seeking investment. Once you have a board and investors and you know you need to get to the next round of funding, it becomes about what information needs to be in your pitch deck to help you do well. So back to this diagram from Airbnb. When I said, hey, gut instinct, someone had a hypothesis that photographs would work, that seems a little naive. Remember back in this diagram, I said you can find a potential improvement either without data or with data. Well, it turns out that without data, you're making a good guess. So you wake up one morning, you get in the shower and go, you know what, those houses that do really well look really nice. That's possible. Maybe it's the camera. But it's much more interesting to ask the computer in a magical Star Trek kind of way, hey, computer, what do all the highly rented houses have in common? And it might come back camera model. Amazingly, this is what machine learning and abundant data is really good at. If you have all this, the machine can find tenuous correlations. There's a correlation between the size of the photographic image and the value of the rental property, which you might then as a human go, maybe it's the camera model, let's run a test. I want to tell you a story about a case study, a company called Circle of Moms. This company started as Circle of Friends back in the days when Facebook didn't have groups. And essentially it was the tool for building a small group for you and your friends, for your Scouts Club or your church organization or whatever. And they built this thing and they were getting lots of people signing up. Many people were creating a group. Very few of those people, once the group was created, had any additional activity. So they go set it up and then nobody would do anything. Less than 20% of the group set up had any activity after the moment of creation. So they had a few million monthly uniques from 10 million registered users, but most of those users were just zombies. And so the founder of the company looked at the data and he found there was one demographic that was far more well-behaved and doing what he wanted than everybody else. And that was mothers. Moms were far more likely to write long messages and attach a picture. They were likely to reply in a thread. They were likely to invite their friends. They were likely to click on things in a news feed. So he basically shut down the whole company. He changed the name to Circle of Moms. He went from 10 million users to 500,000 users. Can you imagine going to your board and saying, I would like to shrink my user base by 95%? That's a terrifying question. But he had the conviction of his data, pivoted to this new market, focused on Circle of Moms. By 2009, he had 4.5 million users who were heavily engaged, and he sold the company to Sugar right around the time that Facebook introduced its groups. So this is a good example of sitting back and looking at the data and exploring it to find out what commonalities or patterns give you a subset of users that are the kind of people you want. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, when you squeeze the squeeze toy, the next thing just bulges out. So when Airbnb started showing really beautiful pictures of rented properties, everybody went there and they were disappointed because it looked far better in the architectural diagram. This is apparently a photograph of a 6-bed Airbnb in New York City. Fortunately, not one I stayed at. But you can imagine the disappointment someone would have if they get to this property and then they give it a low ranking. So that as soon as Airbnb maximized the rentals to beautifully photographed properties, it now had to deal with the crisis of disappointed users and low ratings. Every time you solve one metric, the next one just bulges out. Now, I want to give you some thoughts about data science and critical thinking, because I spent some time teaching a course at Harvard called Data Science and Critical Thinking. We live in a world full of data, but it's very easy to be deceived by that data. We are, in fact, as humans, terrible at data. So I'm going to teach you a neat trick called Benford's Law. If I have a set of 9 buckets in front of me, and I ask each of you a question, and then I throw the answer into the bucket that begins with that number, you would expect a certain thing to happen. So as a little exercise, and we don't really have enough people in chat engaged that will give me this, but I want each of you to type the apartment number or street number of your the street number of your house or apartment. So for example, I live at 4000 Rue Saint-Ambroise, and so mine begins with a 4. So we're looking at the numbers here. And if you look at this and you look at the numbers on them, perfect, this is a great example. So I'm going to go through this and I'm going to look at, so we've got a number that begins with 7, a number begins with 2, one begins with 3, 8, 4, 1, 9, 1, 3, 6, something that looks like a carrot, 1, 5, 2, 7, 3, 1. So looking at these answers, I'm going to do the math here because it's nice that this may even work. This trick may even work just for this. I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 responses. Out of those 17 responses, 1, 2, 3, 4 of them begin with the number 1. Everybody see that? We got 17 responses. 4 out of 17 begin with the number 1. And then if I look at the list, I see a 2, I see a 3, I see a 2, I see a 3. So I've got 2 out of 17 begin with the number 2. And I see 2 out of 17 begin with the number 3, and so on. Everybody understands what I'm talking about here, right? Which is the first digit of your street address. Now, I could have done the same thing for the first digit of your bank balance, or the length of the rivers in the world, or many other things. But let's assume that for each of you, I take your number and I put it into the bucket. So Rita said her number 755, so I'm going to put 1 unit into the 7 bucket. And then Christina said 2, so I'm going to put it in here. And Elizabeth said 33, so I'm going to put it in here because it begins with 3. And Gaurav said 8, so I'm going to put it in here, and so on. And I'm going to show you some fancy animation. This is what we would expect to have happen if we did that. Although I have to, hang on a second. This is what we would expect to have happen if we did that. And you can all applaud silently because making this animation was hard. This is what we would expect to see from random numbers. This is the normal way we would expect these numbers to be allocated if we did this exercise across thousands of people. Benford's law says that's actually not what happens. Roughly 30% of the numbers will begin with a 1, roughly 17% with a 2, roughly 12% with a 3. And in fact, we got this just now with a very small sample size, which is kind of weird because it doesn't usually work like this. But, you know, we got 4/17, which is 23%, by far the largest. And then we got lower for the rest of them and so on. Benford's law that says for a wide variety of data sets, from electricity bills to street addresses to stock prices, you will tend to see 30% of the numbers beginning with a 1 and about 17% beginning with a 2 and so on. This is called Benford's law. It's kind of wizardry. It's kind of a neat trick. There are anecdotal reports that during Brexit, when Greece was being asked to join the EU, they submitted financial information, and an analyst applied Benford's law and said a lot of this data looks like it was made up. It doesn't conform to Benford's law. It looks like the roughly even distribution. So you could argue that Brexit is tied to the lack of ability to use Benford's law or think critically about data. Again, don't put that in newspapers. I don't have proof, but anecdotally, a lot of statisticians have told me that's the case. We are bad at thinking about data. And there are ways that we can figure out if we're making mistakes with that data, but we need to be very circumspect and very judicious. We need to ask ourselves, what else could it be? If there were no correlation, would it look the same? These are questions that people seldom ask, especially if the data confirms what we want to think about. The city of Boston built an application called Street Bump. So I want you to listen carefully. I'm going to ask you if you can tell me what's wrong with this application. The application goes on the passenger seat of a car. When you drive to work and back, it registers the bumps you hit or potholes. And those potholes are sent to the city so they can fix the roads for the people whose roads are in the worst condition. And the app works perfectly well. The accelerometer works. Can anybody tell me why this application is biased or broken? Again, the app is sitting on the passenger seat. Rita, you're right. One tends to drive the same roads. That's part of the solution. Passenger seats on one side only, traveling on the same roads, sort of right. Speed bumps and traffic calming will confuse the data, maybe. The accelerometer is actually pretty good at figuring it out. So I'll give you a leading question. Who has a car they drive by themselves with a phone in the passenger seat on an unlimited data plan? Is there a socioeconomic demographic that might correlate with that? So it turns out, of course, that this model was biased because it showed where all the potholes were for rich white people who drove to and from work and could afford a full data plan. It disadvantaged minorities and people who took public transit, which tended to be poorer and actually had much worse road conditions. So once the city of Boston realized this, they attached sensors to buses and garbage trucks and got a much better map of the city. This is a case where nobody set out with malice to marginalize a population, but by not thinking through the data collection, they inadvertently put bias into the product. Now, you might not know this until you go and deploy it, so you need to visualize the data and go look at it very quickly, but you have to think about that stuff. Another good example of this is Theranos. You've probably all heard of Elizabeth Holmes and her product to try and design a blood testing system that would take a single sample of blood, basically a drop of this versus several test tubes. She went to Google Ventures and said, hey, I'd like to seek your investment. And Google said, oh, well, you're apparently doing tests down at the Walgreens. We'll get back to you. And then one of the VCs at Google hired an intern and said, I'd like you to go get your blood tested. So the intern went to Walgreens. They came back. The guy said, how are you feeling? And the intern said, I'm a little bit dizzy. He took several vials of blood. So Google said, something's up here. We're not going to invest. Trust quantitatively, but always verify qualitatively. Call a few customers. Check that the data is really what you think it is. Go and visualize it on a map or over time and see if you can figure out other patterns. I'll give you another concrete example. Heathrow is planning to build another airport runway. So Heathrow started soliciting complaints by area, because they figured if you get disturbed by the loud noise of a plane and you call in and tell us, we will mark that up as regions that are hearing the airplanes and we'll know where we should avoid flying, and that affects where the runway goes. Well, it looks like Slough complained a lot. In fact, they had the most complaints of any area. But if you start to look at the data and don't just say complaints, but you look at complainants, it becomes evident that Slough had many complaints, but very few complainants. I mean, in this data, 2,128 people made 25,000 complaints about aircraft noise. But if you look at complaints per person, 3 people contacted the airport more than 1,280 times a day. That's 14 times a day. These people had nothing better to do than to call the airport and complain. 10 people made half of all the airplane complaints. If you were just using complaints as a metric for where to run the runway, you would be kowtowing to 10 activists when in fact, you can get rid of half of the complaints by basically buying 10 houses. It's a little strange, but when you look at data differently, you start to see other patterns. Humans are also strangely behaved. If you, when you go to a hotel, they put those little tags that say, please reuse your planet. Please reuse your towel to save the planet. If you say on those little tags, other guests reuse their towel, you'll see a 20% increase, 26% increase in towel reuse. If you say other guests that have used this room reuse their towel, you'll see a 33% increase. That means that shared traits produce strong associations. It might seem strange to think that you don't want to be in a hotel room where other people have reused their towels, but it turns out that this increases human behavior. And this has really strange consequences. Daniel Goroff, who was the head of the Sloan Foundation, told me that when he worked for the Department of Energy in the US, he was responsible for sending out what are called energy nudges. An energy nudge is simply a way of telling you if you're consuming more electricity than others or doing better than others. So in this case, an efficient neighbor, using the idea that social proof from neighbors affects behavior, shows you your efficient neighbors using 635 kilowatt hours. Your neighbors are using 1,626 and you're using 1,902. So you're not doing very well. You have quote unquote room to improve. What they found, and this will confirm everything you know about American politics, is that when you send a report like this to someone who's consuming more and they're a Democrat, they will reduce their energy consumption to be that of their neighbors. When you send a message to a Republican telling them they're using less energy than their neighbors, they will increase their consumption to the level of their neighbors. And so what the Department of Energy did was prune the Energy Nudge mailing list to remove well-behaved Republicans and just not tell them they were being well-behaved in order to maximize the overall energy savings. This kind of thinking might seem evil or subversive, but it's how they got the results, where the end kind of justified the means. As a startup founder, you have to apply this kind of thinking rather than just mindlessly acting on data. You should also be very careful if you use machine learning algorithms. Most AIs are jerks because in the data, we see reflections of ourselves. Google trained its analogy systems for understanding how words relate to one another with these analogy puzzles on 3 million words of Google News text from the last 50 years. Well, in the last 50 years, humans have done some pretty bad things. They've marginalized Blacks and women. They've got lots and lots of bad behavior we're only now understanding. But machine learning is showing it to us right under our noses. So for example, if you ask this machine learning algorithm based on this data, father is to doctor as mother is to, it will say nurse. Man is to programmer as woman is to homemaker. You can say, what is the closest word to black male? The word is assaulted. What is the closest word to white male? The word is entitled to. In fact, these biases reflect gender profession, so that women are much more likely to be considered nurses, librarians, nannies, stylists, or dancers, whereas men are much more likely to be architects, captains, philosophers, legends, and heroes based on word prediction. This leads to really troubling issues. For example, a few years ago, if you Googled unprofessional hairstyles on Google, you almost immediately saw Black women's hairstyles and in some cases redheads. So as we start to think about data properly, we need to spend much more of our time being circumspect and sort of questioning whether or not this stuff works. So I want to leave some time for questions, but I want to end this by thinking about data in a new way. You may have heard the story of Archimedes. Archimedes was a scientist and he was an advisor to a king, and the king had a crown made. He gave a jeweler some gold and said, make me a crown. And the jeweler brought back a crown that weighed as much as the gold that he had been given. And the king held the crown up and thought, this feels kind of light. Because the king didn't know what the word light meant. He was actually saying, this crown feels less dense than I expected it to. There was a chance that the jeweler had melted down the gold, added in some silver, kept a bit of the gold for himself, and then taken this gold silver alloy, undetectably made a crown. So the king said, I suspect this person, throw him in jail. Archimedes, go and tell me if I've been robbed. And there was no way to do spectrographic analysis and understand what made up the gold and so on. So Archimedes needed to figure out what was the density of this crown compared to a block of gold that had the same weight. And as most Greeks, he liked to take baths and he couldn't figure out the solution. So the apocryphal story has that Archimedes went home to sit in the bath. And as he sat down in the bath, the water level rose. And he realized that he could measure the volume of an irregular solid, like a human or a crown, by immersing it in water and watching how much the water went up. The story has that he jumped out of the bathtub and ran down the street naked, yelling, Eureka, I've solved it. History shows that's actually not what happened. They knew how to do this stuff already. He had an apparatus that he used for it. But the story is still true. Oh, by the way, the jeweler was lying and was beheaded. The story here is that Archimedes had taken baths before. This was not his first experience immersing himself in water. But it had never occurred to him that a bath might be a way to measure the volume of an irregular solid until the king asked the question. The act of asking the question made Archimedes realize that he was literally marinating in the answer. The key to analytics is asking a good question. If you can ask the right question, you'll find that the answer is all around you. Once upon a time, before we had abundant data, before the digital world was collecting all of this information, a leader was the person who convinced others to act in the absence of data. Today, the leader is the person who knows what questions to ask, because when you ask the right question, when you ask a question about the right business model at the right stage, where is the greatest risk and what is the line in the sand I need to get it to and how do I get there and run experiments? When you ask questions like that, you will dramatically increase the chance of your organization succeeding, whether it's an early stage startup or a big business. And this facility with data is at the core of lean analytics. So we have some time for questions, and I have a few more slides I'm going to get into here, but I wanted to pause because it's hard to listen to one person talk for this long, and I appreciate your attention. And so if any of you have questions or things you'd like me to focus on more, I've got a bunch more slides here, but I wanted to ask you where you wanted me to go next. Please feel free to type in the chat anything that you'd like to know about how to apply this to your specific business, or anything that you would like me to dig into more deeply, such as message maps or hardcore interviews, or how to do this in a B2B environment. There's lots of other topics that I could get into here. And Pierangelo, if you have topics that you'd like me to get into too, I brought a whole bunch more slides, but I want to make sure that they're relevant to the audience.
Yeah, let's give them a few extra seconds to see if anyone has a more prominent interest.
Rita, yeah, the one metric that matters. It is the one metric you focus on. And it is, when we first said that, we were being kind of dramatic, and the one metric that matters is the thing we're known for. If I had to pick an organization that looks at 50 metrics versus an organization that looks at one but is myopic about the others, I would prefer, particularly in the early stages, that it's an organization that looks at one metric, because the one metric that matters focuses you, and focus is the biggest risk in a startup world. So it's really about the one metric that you're currently meeting on and actively trying to improve. It is the hypothesis that your current sprint is trying to test. It is the thing that your executive team should be talking about on the Monday and the Friday. That doesn't mean you stop counting number of trouble tickets, but if you expect, 1 out of every 100 customers is going to file a trouble ticket that week, you don't really care about that. I mean, go fix the trouble ticket, make sure the customer is taken care of. If that suddenly goes to 10 trouble tickets per 100 customers that week, that suddenly becomes something you need to worry about. So the point is more that the metric that matters is the one that you are trying to get past the line in the sand in order to move the business forward. The other metrics are sort of reporting and can be managed by exception. Anything on measuring impact for social enterprises or social change? So Mary, I will say there's a 7th business model we didn't include in the book because it's supposed to be lean and it's already pretty thick. And that was on nonprofits and causes. We looked and we talked to a few people about Kickstarters and nonprofits. In most cases, the biggest lesson here is that when we talked to people who had successful Kickstarters, they told us half of the people who backed it wanted the product, but the other half wanted the product to exist. And so there is a lot of giving people a reason to back you that's very emotional, and then making sure that those people have a sense of accomplishment. And obviously, if it's a social cause or a nonprofit, it's about getting permission to turn them from a one-time donor into a repeat donor, because new customer acquisition is vastly, or new donor acquisition is vastly more expensive than repeat donor acquisition. So that is a huge factor in those things. As far as measuring social change, it comes down to the same thing. What is the metric you want to see? Now, I also in my spare time run a conference called Forward 50, which has since become the world's biggest gathering on digital government. We had it 2 weeks ago. And one of my favorite case studies came from food stamps in the US. In the US, there is a move to get food subsidies into the poorest Americans' hands. And they were measuring how much money gets sent out by food subsidies, how many people claim them. Those are all good metrics. But the metric that turned out to be most useful for them was how many people who should have been able to claim food stamps were unable to do so. That's a metric that produces change, because you immediately find out who those people are and what the obstacles were that prevented them from doing so. And then you're able to tackle the systemic issue of accessibility to those programs. And so what's really important for societal change is to get behind the underlying, like not to treat the Band-Aid symptoms, but to treat the underlying issue. In that case, the problem wasn't, is there money for food subsidies? The problem was, are the most vulnerable among us able to access food subsidies? And they're often ones who either have neuroatypical challenges, or they lack access to modern technology, or they're mistrustful of government and public sector. So I think for measuring impact for social changes, for social enterprises, obviously there's this idea of the triple bottom line. I like to say that any online business is and I think this is my pinned tweet, is dealing with reputation, it's dealing with attention, and it's dealing with money. And it's very easy to sacrifice one at the expense of another. If I endorse a product for money, but that product is questionable, then my reputation goes down and my revenues go up. If I spend money on advertising, then my money goes down, but my attention goes up. And so most transactions in the social sphere are a trade-off between revenue, attention, and reputation. And the key is to keep track of those three bottom lines, and also the triple bottom lines of sustainability and social good and revenue and so on. For B Corps and other types of corporation, there are a number of books that have been written about this. I'm going to look in my browser while I do this and see if I can find it, because there have been several books on it. I think there is a woman named Beth Kanter, Kanter, who we actually advised years and years ago on social profit and social good. And I just pasted a link she has about her nonprofit dashboards from like 10 years ago. Beth is a very good person to follow if you care about the sort of social impact of metrics and how to apply analytics to social good and social environment. So I would strongly suggest going to look at Beth's work, Mary, and she's written a couple of great books on the subject. So Mafalda, metrics from marketplaces like Amazon. The key for a marketplace, I'll bring this back to, I purposely left the slides in here, but let's go back to the customer journey lifecycle. You're welcome, Mary. I'm trying to multitask here while still looking at these things. Let me see if I can find them. Here we go. So this is a marketplace one. So Mafalda, over here, the way we've drawn this, there's two groups. There's buyers and sellers. And the buyers and sellers are obviously doing different things. I'm going to try and go back to Spotlight so I can show you this. So the sellers, obviously, they have an account they create. They create some listings on that account. And then hopefully those listings are found in searches by buyers. Buyers visit the thing and they search, and hopefully a listing and a search results in a match. That buyer then has a short list of the things they'd like. They buy something, it gets delivered. The buyer rates the seller rates the buyer. And if it's just a one-time purchase, that's fine. On the other hand, the delivery happens and maybe this person decides they like this seller, so they buy from them again. Or maybe this buyer buys from the person. So you have repeat buyers for a seller, repeat sellers for a buyer. So you really have two different journeys here. On the left-hand side, we have the seller journey. Now, if I create listings, some of those listings might be fraudulent. And so someone might report it as fraudulent, or maybe I don't deliver well and the buyer says this person didn't sell me what I wanted. So there's a fraud rate that I care about as the marketplace owner. Over here, on both cases, I want the buyer and the seller to sign up. So I want the account to send messages to this person saying, hey, list more stuff. I want the buyer, when they sign up, say, hey, I'm looking for a new car. They get notifications saying we found a car that might match it. How many people get that email? How many open it and then go through and click? So there's sort of the search, and then there's the sign up element to this. And then, once this buyer has bought stuff, they may opt out and say, I don't really care anymore. I got the car I was looking for. At the same time, the seller may cancel their account. The listing may expire. They may become disengaged, not at the listing, so they churn out. So I tend to think of the two-sided market like this. And these are the metrics that you care about. Sign-up rate for a buyer, searches per visit for a buyer, seller visits, listings count, new listings per day, how many searches have a blank result, how many results generate a click-through, how many of the things in the short list lead to a transaction, how many of those transactions lead to delivery. Here you're obviously looking at click-throughs, good results, conversions, ratings, buyer lifetime value, seller lifetime value, gross revenue, net revenue. So Mafalda, that's kind of what I would put together for this. And again, this is just a high-level view that you can probably modify to tailor to your individual business. I think I addressed everybody. Any other questions? I have, as you can see, I got lots of spare slides. I can just jump around them if you want to know what they are. And Angela, if there are no more questions, I'm happy to share some information on how to get in touch with me if you have further questions. Obviously, Lean Analytics is out there. You've recorded this, so people will be able to look at it as well. Yeah, there's some other recordings of things that are online for this, and this is the best way to reach myself and my co-author, Ben. But Pierangelo, thank you very much for having me. It's always great to do stuff with DCU, and Hopefully this was helpful, and I know you've recorded it, so I guess people can go look at that later if they have further questions.